Sarah Chen stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror at 6:47 a.m., her laptop already humming with notifications from the next room. 8 hours of sleep, according to her fitness tracker, yet her eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who hadn't truly rested in months. The dark circles seemed deeper today, and her face carried a puffiness that no amount of expensive skincare could touch. The irony wasn't lost on her. A second-generation Korean-American working as a wellness consultant, advising Fortune 500 companies on employee health programs, while her own body quietly rebelled against everything she preached. She'd tried every trendy diet, downloaded countless apps, and even hired a personal trainer who insisted that discipline was just a matter of wanting it more. But wanting what exactly? To feel human again. In the kitchen, Sarah reached for her usual large coffee mug, pausing when her fingers brushed against something else in the cabinet. A small ceramic bowl her grandmother had left her, barely larger than her cupped palms. She'd forgotten it was there, tucked behind the oversized plates and portion control containers that never seemed to work. The bowl was simple, cream-colored with a thin blue rim, designed for rice in portions that seemed almost comically small by American standards. Halmoni had used it every day until she passed at 92, weighing exactly what she had at 35, her mind sharp and her movements fluid despite never setting foot in a gym. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her college roommate, Michelle. "Coffee in 20? Need to vent about the new cleanse I'm starting." She almost said yes, then caught herself. Michelle's coffee dates had become competitive stress sessions about whose life was more chaotic, whose sleep was worse, whose metabolism had betrayed them more completely. The conversations left Sarah feeling drained, as if exhaustion were a badge of honor they were both fighting to earn. Instead, she texted back, "Rain check, early meeting." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did have a video call with a client in Seoul at 8 a.m., a skincare company wanting to understand why their American expansion wasn't resonating. The founder, Mrs. Kim, always appeared on camera with an almost preternatural calmness, her skin luminous, despite being 20 years older than Sarah. During the call, Sarah found herself studying Mrs. Kim's background, a simple apartment with clean lines, a small table set low to the ground, and morning light filtering through what looked like rice paper screens. There was something about the environment that seemed to breathe, unlike Sarah's own cluttered condo with its harsh LED bulbs and constant electronic hum. "Your research suggests Americans want more intensive routines," Mrs. Kim was saying, her voice steady and unhurried. "But perhaps this is why they are so tired. In Korea, we believe beauty comes from what you don't do as much as what you do." After the call, Sarah sat in her kitchen, still holding her grandmother's rice bowl. She remembered visiting Halmoni's apartment in Seoul as a child. The way meals appeared in small dishes, each bite savored slowly, the way her grandmother moved through morning rituals with deliberate precision rather than frantic efficiency. She dismissed those memories as old-fashioned when she'd grown up and embraced the American dream of bigger portions, bigger ambitions, bigger everything. But now, with her nervous system stuck in permanent overdrive and her body storing stress in places she didn't know existed, those small, quiet rituals seemed less like constraints and more like wisdom she'd been too busy to hear. That evening, instead of ordering her usual oversized dinner, Sarah cooked a simple meal and served it in her grandmother's bowl. The portion looked almost childlike on her dining table, but as she ate slowly, no phone, no laptop, just the quiet sound of chopsticks against ceramic, something in her chest began to unclench. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable. But for the first time in months, she finished eating without reaching for more, not because she was restricting herself, but because she actually felt satisfied. If you've ever felt tired even after a full night of sleep, or frustrated with diets that don't last, tell us in the comments which part of this story feels familiar, and stay with us for the next chapters. The rice bowl sat on Sarah's kitchen counter the next morning, a quiet reminder of the previous night's unexpected peace. She'd slept better, not perfectly, but with fewer of the restless turns that usually marked her nights. Her fitness tracker showed the same 8 hours, but somehow her body felt less like it was dragging through quicksand. Dr. Martinez, her primary care physician, had been tracking Sarah's gradual health decline for 2 years, creeping weight gain, elevated cortisol, blood sugar that teetered on the edge of concerning. "You're doing everything right on paper," he'd said at her last appointment. "Diet looks clean, exercise is consistent, but your numbers suggest your body is under constant stress." The mystery had frustrated them both. Sarah's food diary was exemplary, her gym attendance religious. Yet her metabolism seemed to be slowly grinding to a halt, as if her body had simply stopped cooperating with the very strategies that were supposed to heal it. At work, Sarah found herself watching her Korean colleagues differently during their video conferences. There was something about their energy, alert but not wired, focused but not frantic. During lunch breaks, while she scarfed down salads at her desk, they disappeared entirely, returning 40 minutes later looking refreshed rather than rushed. "Do you ever eat at your desk?" she asked James, a Korean developer, during a rare in-person meeting. He looked puzzled. "Why would I do that? Lunch is for eating." The simplicity of his response struck her as almost radical. When had eating become something to multitask through rather than simply experience? That evening, Sarah made another small change. Instead of checking her phone while cooking, she left it in another room. The silence felt strange at first, almost anxious, as if she'd forgotten how to exist without the constant stream of information flooding her nervous system. She prepared her meal with the same deliberate pace she remembered from watching her grandmother, arranging small portions in the ceramic bowl. Rice, steamed vegetables, a small piece of fish, nothing exotic or complicated, but presented with a care that felt almost ceremonial. As she ate, Sarah became aware of flavors she usually missed while scrolling through work emails. The sweetness of the rice, the way the fish flaked against her chopsticks, the satisfying crunch of lightly steamed broccoli. Halfway through the modest portion, she paused, chopsticks suspended. She was actually satisfied. Not stuffed, not restriction satisfied, but genuinely content. The realization was so unusual that she almost reached for seconds out of habit, then stopped. Her body wasn't asking for more food. It was asking for her to trust this unfamiliar sensation of having enough. Later that night, Sarah made another change borrowed from her grandmother's evening ritual. Instead of scrolling her phone until her eyes burned, she dimmed the lights 2 hours before bed and sat quietly with a cup of herbal tea, also served in a small ceramic cup that matched the rice bowl. The first 20 minutes felt torturous. Her mind raced through tomorrow's to-do list, unfinished projects, social media feeds she was missing. But gradually, something began to shift. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders, permanently hunched from years of laptop work, began to drop. She thought about Mrs. Kim's words from the video call. "Beauty comes from what you don't do as much as what you do." What if health worked the same way? Michelle texted around 10 p.m. "Started the new cleanse, already starving but powering through. Coffee tomorrow to compare notes." Sarah looked at the message, then at her grandmother's teacup, still warm in her hands. The invitation felt like stepping back into a world where exhaustion was currency and suffering was virtue, a world she was quietly beginning to leave behind. She replied, "Hope it goes well for you. I'm experimenting with something different." 3 weeks into what Sarah had begun thinking of as her grandmother experiment, the changes were subtle but undeniable. Her jeans fit differently, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed the waistband didn't dig in after meals. More importantly, her 3 p.m. energy crashes had disappeared, replaced by a steady alertness that felt sustainable rather than caffeinated. Dr. Martinez seemed genuinely surprised at her follow-up appointment. "Your cortisol levels are down significantly," he said, studying her lab results. "Blood sugar is much more stable." What changed? Sarah felt slightly ridiculous explaining her new habits. eating from a small bowl, putting her phone away during meals, dimming lights before bed. It sounded insignificant compared to the elaborate protocols she'd tried before. The macro counting, the high-intensity workouts, the supplements that promised to hack her metabolism. Interesting, Dr. Martinez said, making notes. We're seeing more research on how environmental factors affect stress hormones. The nervous system responds to ritual and predictability. Meanwhile, Michelle had cycled through 2 more diets, each leaving her more frustrated than the last. "I don't understand how you're losing weight without trying," she said during one of their rescheduled coffee dates. "Are you secretly doing keto? Intermittent fasting?" "I'm just eating less, I think," Sarah said, though that wasn't quite right. She wasn't eating less food, so much as eating with more attention, using her grandmother's bowl as a natural portion guide that somehow felt generous rather than restrictive. Michelle frowned. "But you're not tracking anything. How do you know if you're in a calorie deficit?" The question highlighted something Sarah was still processing. She'd stopped thinking about food as numbers and started experiencing it as nourishment. The rice bowl held exactly the amount that left her satisfied but not heavy, alert but not sluggish. It was as if her grandmother's generation had figured out portion control through intuition rather than calculation. At work, Sarah began implementing her new rhythms more deliberately. She took actual lunch breaks, eating slowly in the break room, instead of multitasking at her desk. The initial guilt, that feeling of being unproductive, gradually gave way to improved afternoon focus. Her Korean client, Mrs. Kim, noticed the change during their weekly calls. "You seem different," she observed, "more present." Sarah laughed. "I've been trying some of my grandmother's old habits." "Korean grandmother," she clarified. "Ah." Mrs. Kim nodded knowingly. "The old ways. We have a saying, the body remembers what the mind forgets. Your grandmother's wisdom is in your cells." That evening, Sarah's sister called while she was preparing dinner in her newly peaceful kitchen. "Mom says you've been weird lately," Lisa said. "Not answering texts right away, skipping family dinner last week because it was too late." Sarah paused, chopsticks in hand. She had turned down family dinner, a chaotic affair that typically started at 9 p.m. and involved oversized portions of heavy food that left everyone feeling sluggish and overfull. The old Sarah would have gone anyway, not wanting to disappoint anyone, then spent the next day feeling physically and emotionally drained. "I'm trying to take better care of myself," Sarah said. "By being antisocial?" The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Sarah was being more selective about social commitments, but not out of isolation, out of a growing recognition that her energy was finite and precious. The late dinners, the stress-eating coffee dates, the obligations that left her feeling depleted rather than connected. She was learning to say no. "I'm being more intentional about how I spend my time," she corrected. After hanging up, Sarah sat with her grandmother's rice bowl, now empty, and contemplated the unexpected resistance her changes were creating. Nobody seemed concerned when she was exhausted and stressed, but the moment she started setting boundaries around her well-being, people noticed and pushed back. She thought about her grandmother, who had lived to 92 with grace and vitality, never apologizing for her quiet routines or her refusal to overcomplicate simple things like eating and sleeping. Had Halmoni faced this same pressure to abandon wisdom for the sake of fitting in? Would you rather force yourself with willpower or redesign your environment and habits like this character is learning to do? Comment which path makes more sense to you, and share this episode with someone who needs a gentler approach to change. The test came in the form of a work crisis 6 weeks into Sarah's new routine. A major client was threatening to leave, demanding a complete strategy overhaul within 72 hours. The old Sarah would have pulled all-nighters, mainlined coffee, and ordered takeout to fuel marathon work sessions. Instead, she found herself faced with an impossible choice: abandon her carefully cultivated habits to meet the deadline, or maintain her boundaries and risk professional consequences. The first night she compromised. She worked until 10 p.m., later than usual, but not the midnight sessions she used to embrace. She ate dinner from her grandmother's bowl, even though part of her brain insisted she didn't have time for slow eating. The meal took 12 minutes. The sense of groundedness it provided lasted for hours. By the second day, her colleague Derek was openly skeptical. "Sarah's being weird," she overheard him tell their boss. "Leaves exactly at 7 p.m., won't work through lunch. Maybe she's not committed to saving this account." The comment hit her like cold water. Was she sabotaging her career for the sake of a ceramic bowl and some new age ideas about eating slowly? The familiar anxiety began creeping back, the voice that had driven her to burnout in the first place. "You're not working hard enough. You're not doing enough. You are not enough." That evening, Sarah called Mrs. Kim for advice, ostensibly about the client crisis, but really seeking guidance from someone who seemed to have mastered the balance between productivity and peace. "In Korea, we have a concept called nunchi," Mrs. Kim explained. "It means understanding the flow of situations, knowing when to push and when to yield. But first, you must be calm enough to sense the flow. What if the flow demands sacrificing my health?" Mrs. Kim was quiet for a moment. "What would your grandmother say?" Sarah knew the answer immediately. Halmoni had lived through war, poverty, and immigration, genuine crises that made client deadlines look trivial. Yet she had never abandoned her essential rhythms, the small portions, the quiet evenings, the respect for her body's need for rest and nourishment. On the third day, Sarah made a radical decision. She would complete the project excellently, but within the constraints of her new life structure. She worked with focused intensity during business hours, took her lunch break mindfully, and left at a reasonable time to maintain her evening routine. The strategy she presented was arguably better than anything she would have produced during a caffeine-fueled all-nighter. Her mind was clear, her creativity unforced. The client accepted the proposal. Derek seemed almost disappointed. "Lucky break," he muttered. But Sarah's boss, Janet, pulled her aside afterward. "I've noticed you seem more focused lately, less frantic but more productive. What changed?" "I started eating dinner in a smaller bowl," Sarah said, then laughed at how absurd it sounded. Janet raised an eyebrow. "That's it? It's more complicated than that. The bowl is just a symbol, I guess, for treating my body and time differently." That weekend, Sarah finally agreed to family dinner, but with new boundaries. She offered to host instead of attending the usual late-night chaos at her parents' house. Using her grandmother's bowl as inspiration, she served smaller portions of food prepared with care, eaten without television or phone distractions. Her family seemed confused by the unfamiliar rhythm, the deliberate pace, the actual conversation that happened when people weren't simultaneously scrolling social media. But by the end of the evening, her father was leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. "I feel good," he said, surprised. "Usually I'm uncomfortably full after dinner." Her mother examined the rice bowl Sarah had used. "This was Halmoni's, wasn't it? I remember her eating from it every day." She paused, running her finger along the blue rim. "She never gained an ounce after age 30. We always thought she was just lucky." "Maybe she was wise," Sarah suggested. As her family left, Sarah stood in her quiet kitchen, washing her grandmother's bowl with the same careful attention she now brought to everything. The ceramic was warm and smooth under her fingers, a daily reminder that some solutions were so simple they looked like nothing at all. 3 months in, Sarah had a realization that changed everything. She wasn't on a diet. She wasn't following a program. She was simply living like her grandmother had lived, and her body was responding as if it had been waiting decades for this particular kindness. The insight crystallized during a conversation with Dr. Martinez about her latest blood work. Every marker had improved, not dramatically but consistently, in the direction of health rather than slow decline. "I don't understand what you're doing," he admitted. "But whatever it is, keep doing it." Sarah tried to explain the rice bowl, the evening rituals, the phone-free meals, but even to her own ears, it sounded insubstantial. How do you describe the weight of wisdom embedded in something as simple as portion control through ceramic rather than calculation? "It's not what I'm doing," she finally said. "It's how I'm thinking about my body, like it's worth taking care of instead of something to be conquered." That was the secret, she realized. For years, she'd approached her health like a war. Aggressive diets to shock her metabolism, punishing workouts to force fat loss, supplements to hack her body's natural processes. She'd treated her exhaustion as weakness to be overcome rather than information to be heard. But her grandmother's way was different. The small bowl wasn't restriction, it was respect for the body's actual needs. The slow eating wasn't a technique. It was a recognition that nourishment required attention. The evening rituals weren't rules. They were love, made visible through daily practice. Michelle finally asked directly, "Are you seeing a nutritionist, a therapist, something?" They were sitting in a cafe, Sarah with her usual coffee, Michelle with her third diet attempt of the year, a protein shake that claimed to reset her metabolism in 10 days. "I'm eating like my grandmother ate," Sarah said simply. Michelle laughed. "That's it? That's your big secret?" "That's it. But what about macros? What about intermittent fasting? What about none of that?" Sarah interrupted gently. "What if the answer isn't more complex than what people have been doing for thousands of years?" Michelle's face shifted through several emotions, frustration, skepticism, and finally something that looked like grief. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not easy," Sarah said. "It's simple. There's a difference." The difference was this. Easy implied no effort, but Sarah's transformation had required constant choice. The choice to eat slowly when the world demanded speed, to prioritize sleep when culture celebrated exhaustion, to set boundaries when others expected endless availability. Simple meant the actions themselves weren't complicated, even when the commitment to them was profound. That evening, Sarah video-called Mrs. Kim with an update on their latest marketing campaign, but the conversation drifted to deeper territory. "You understand now," Mrs. Kim observed, "why our skincare philosophy doesn't translate easily to Western markets. Americans want dramatic transformation. Koreans understand that lasting beauty comes from daily attention to small things." "Like eating from a small bowl," Sarah said, holding up her grandmother's ceramic piece. Mrs. Kim smiled. "Like respecting your body enough to feed it properly, rest it adequately, and move it with intention rather than punishment." After the call, Sarah sat in her dimly lit living room, teacup warm in her hands, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the forced positivity she used to chase through motivational podcasts and self-help books, but a quiet satisfaction with the simple act of being in her body. The rice bowl sat on the table beside her, unremarkable to anyone else, but containing for Sarah the entire architecture of a different way of living. Tomorrow she would fill it again with exactly the right amount of food, eat slowly while paying attention, and trust her body's ancient wisdom about what constituted enough. It was such a small thing. It was everything. 1 year later, Sarah stood in her kitchen preparing lunch, her grandmother's rice bowl as familiar in her hands as breathing. The changes had become invisible to her daily awareness, eating slowly, sleeping in rhythm with natural light, moving through her days with intention rather than frantic urgency. But others noticed. Dr. Martinez had stopped ordering extra tests, her numbers stable in healthy ranges. Her sister, Lisa, had started asking about her secret, not accusingly anymore, but with genuine curiosity. Even Derek at work had quietly begun taking actual lunch breaks, inspired by Sarah's consistent energy levels. The most profound change wasn't visible in any mirror or measurable by any scale. Sarah's relationship with her body had fundamentally shifted from adversarial to collaborative. Instead of fighting her natural rhythms, she had learned to work with them. Michelle stopped by that afternoon, looking genuinely curious rather than skeptical for the first time in months. "Can you teach me about the bowl thing?" she asked. Sarah pulled her grandmother's ceramic piece from the cabinet, running her finger along the familiar blue rim. "It's not really about the bowl," she said. "It's about listening." "Listening to what?" "To what your body actually needs, instead of what diet culture says it should want." They ate together in Sarah's quiet kitchen. Michelle struggling at first with the slow pace, the absence of phone distractions, the radical act of paying attention to flavors and fullness cues that had been shouted down by years of external rules about eating. "This is harder than counting macros," Michelle admitted. "It's harder because it requires trust," Sarah agreed. "Trust that your body knows things your mind has forgotten." That evening, Sarah received a package from her mother. Another small ceramic bowl, nearly identical to her grandmother's. The note inside was brief. "Found this in Halmony's Things. Thought you might want to carry on the tradition." As Sarah held the second bowl, she remembered her grandmother's words from years ago. "The body remembers what the mind forgets." At the time, it had sounded like old-fashioned superstition. Now, she understood it as biological truth. Her grandmother's wisdom hadn't been about restriction or discipline in the Western sense. It had been about creating an environment where healthy choices were natural choices, where the right portion size was guided by ceramic rather than calculation, where respect for the body's needs was expressed through daily ritual rather than weekend retreats. 6 months later, Sarah started a blog called Small Bowls, Big Wisdom, sharing the science behind her grandmother's intuitive practices. The response surprised her. Thousands of people hungry for permission to trust their bodies rather than the latest diet trend. She wrote, "My grandmother never counted calories, but she stayed effortlessly slim until her death at 92. Her secret wasn't willpower, it was architecture. She built her days around small practices that honored her body's actual needs rather than forcing it to conform to external expectations." 2 years in, Sarah looked back on her old life, the exhaustion, the constant dieting, the war with her own body, with compassion rather than regret. That version of herself had been doing the best she could with the tools she'd been given. She just hadn't known that some of the most powerful tools were sitting quietly in her own kitchen cabinet. Now, each morning as she prepared breakfast in her grandmother's bowl, Sarah felt connected to something larger than individual willpower, a lineage of women who understood that taking care of the body was an act of wisdom, not vanity, of love, not control. The ceramic was still simple, cream-colored with a thin blue rim, but it held within its small circumference everything Sarah had needed to learn about nourishment, satisfaction, and the profound power of enough. If this story reminded you that real transformation comes from small habits repeated over time, not from overnight fixes, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to start this journey with you in the next story.